Today's episode of the Energy Newsbeat podcast is brought to you by Inveris. The energy industry faces massive challenges every day, and the events over the last 2 years have caused huge disruptions like never before. Companies in the energy industry need actionable intelligence and a single source of truth that brings all the data together. Inveris is the energy specialized technology partner that provides intelligent connections for a global energy ecosystem. Only Inveris has the analytics, people, experience, and industry scope to connect the right data and information in the right way to discover missed opportunities and deliver fast outcomes. Find out more at Inveris.com. That's ENVERUS.com.
Hello, everybody. Today is not just a great day, it's a fabulous day. My name is Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group, and I've got a special guest for everybody today. I'd like to take a second and introduce the Larry Glover. Larry is the president and CEO of the Glover Group. And I'm going to have a full disclosure here for a sec. I've gotten to know Larry as a friend over the last couple of years. And I really enjoy having these discussions with Larry. And he is one of the top guys on the planet. Larry, thank you for coming by the podcast.
Stu, it is absolutely my pleasure to be here and to sit with you. It's I can't think of a better way to spend a good Thursday afternoon.
Well, I'll tell you, I enjoy our conversations. And do you remember The Last Samurai? If you ever saw that, when you had the samurai and Tom Cruise, and he always loved his discussions. I always treasure our discussions because no holds, it's anything goes. So we may have to have our producers cut a lot of this out, but we'll see. Larry, tell us what's going on with you right now.
Stu, thank you for that. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to be part of an Energy Central podcast. I think I followed the podcast and the work that you guys do. I think it's just absolutely tremendous. So my hat's off to you with that. I'm here today, Stu, and would love to talk about the LMI audiences, the lower middle income audiences,
right,
and their energy world, and how these LMI audiences are impacted so significantly for all of our energy decisions. And so whether we're talking about energy affordability, and that gives us one level to talk about, or whether we're talking about the utilities' role in this energy transition as we move to this great transition of energy, and you put a number on it, 2035, 2050, you call it, you make a mark on the wall. But then lastly, I'd love for us to have some sense of conversation as we talk about the impact of all of what we're seeing, and the impact of what we're seeing in a way that it's measurable, and that way we're able to replicate it. And so that's the other side of the equation that I think is important. How do we measure the impact of this? And everybody talks about this thing called equity as a way of measuring. And that's part of our conversation, I think, as well.
I love your comment because there's the ESG term has been thrown around, environment, social, and governance.
Yes.
And so now it's almost none. And it is my belief that there is no ESG without accountability. And I love your measurable, because measurable is a form of accountability, because you got to be able to measure something to hold people accountable. I love that aspect, Larry.
Absolutely. Well, you'll remember that, in the world, we would always say, if it's not measurable, it's not doable. If you can't measure what you do, or you're really doing. And I think the same applies here.
Yep.
But the challenge that we've always had is finding the right unit of measurement in order to be able to evaluate. And that's part of the challenge. And that's part of what what we need to be able to look at, and that's where
Well,
we're going.
before we can talk about measurement, let's back up to the LMI group and what you're doing,
Yes.
because that leads us into the measurement. Now that we've established measurement, it's pretty darn cool. Tell us what your thoughts are, because we've always talked about the disproportionately impacted communities and countries. Let's not leave out the fact that the disproportionately impacted countries are just as important around the world, but the disproportionately impacted communities. And I absolutely love the description of the LMI, because it's the lower middle income class, rather than just, it's inclusive in keeping in a wider breadth of citizens.
I think the beauty there, Stu, is that when you talk about energy, it's only limited by the scope of your conversation, because it is a global issue. And all of the issues that we look at on a local level, whether we're talking about energy supply, energy distribution, and what the new energy roadmap is going to look like, they are global issues. And as we see the development here domestically, we're having the same kinds of issues. If you look at what Germany has done and their strategy around energy and the use of nuclear and the like, just kind of tells you that none of this is a singular conversation. It really is pretty global.
Right.
So let me back up and talk about this LMI audience.
Okay.
You know, as we look at our global landscape, or as we look at our national landscape,
Right.
we have groups of individuals, groups of consumers who tend to be low to moderate income.
Right.
That becomes a real significant issue when we're talking energy, because we're talking about the impact of energy burden. We're talking about how much is there around the cost of energy. But when
you're on a roll, don't lose that thought.
Yes.
But can you describe energy burden a little bit because they may not get that one.
Absolutely. So the energy burden is reflected in how difficult is it for you to address all of your energy cost and energy needs.
Oh, cool. Yep.
All right. And the energy burden statistically is calculated by the cost of energy for you and how much of your discretionary income you have to spend on energy. And there is a rank. The average household, the average upscale household spends a little bit more than 1.6, 1.7% of their discretionary income on energy. You get an average US household that's probably closer to 3% or 4%. You now get into the nuances of discretion, because when you look at households of color versus traditionally white households, that difference is often 3 to 4 times as much.
Wow.
We really get to this place when we talk about low income, high energy burden families, and that could be as much as 26% of their discretionary income. I know I just threw out a whole lot of numbers there, but think about 26%. We used to live by the scale that says, if you're a young person starting out in an apartment, your rent should cost you no more than 30% of your annual. Now we're talking about this as your energy cost. That's a significant burden, and do we know that 30% of African-American households gets a shutoff notice every month? 23% of Hispanic households get a shutoff notice.
What were those numbers? What were those numbers again?
Yes. 23%.
Wow.
Of Hispanic households. No, I'm sorry, that's the reverse. 23% of African-American households receive a shutoff notice from their utility company every month. That number goes up to closer to 30% when we're talking Hispanic households. So as we talk about disproportionately affected communities, we see that not only is that energy burden higher,
Right.
their interaction with the utility companies are also very different. There's a
Wow.
very different approach. And so as we talk about these communities, we can't divorce those issues. Those issues are in fact coupled together, because that's how we get to solutions.
You and I have talked and had so many really deep thought conversations. Larry, all these years, those numbers are still staggering to me, even after all of our conversations. That's staggering to me.
They are. And
Wow.
and so as we talk about this, we look at communities,
Right.
and what are we doing within our communities to help to balance these scales?
Right.
I mean, on a federal level, we have energy assistance programs that provide some sense of relief. There are statewide initiatives, and in some cases, even local initiatives to help you to cover these exorbitant energy costs.
Right.
And as we look at them, and as we understand what their impact is, it becomes also really, really pretty significant for these communities. Yeah.
So what kind of solutions are you seeing around the corner? I'm seeing a lot of programs that are out there, and some of those programs sound good, but maybe this comes into the part where we talk about what is measurable, because some of them, you and I were talking last week, and some of these are based on false numbers, and they're throwing money at it and then walking away.
Yes.
I mean, is that a fair assumption?
Mm-hmm. It's a fair assumption, because I think for a great part, we've always thought that if we can throw dollars at it, if you got enough dollars, you don't have problems. But that's really not the truth, because it's about systems. And when we talk about these LMI communities, we are talking about community systems, community infrastructure, community goals and initiative. But I think that the key here is that it's not that you can't build programs, but how do programs land on these communities? And are there legislative challenges and issues that prohibit them from maybe allowing the best solutions to come to the table? There's clearly a set in the world of best practices that exist. For example, I was reading a study on energy affordability and connectivity for low-income communities. And this study looked at 6 states: New Jersey, Connecticut, Michigan, Ohio, Maryland, and it also looked at the District of Columbia.
Okay.
And it looked at those energy assistance programs that are available for those residents, and they all pretty much address the same kinds of issues.
Right.
But here's the challenge when I say it's about how they intertwine and interact. If you're a customer, if you're a low-income customer who has to fill out an application for LIHEAP, that low-income heating and assistance fund, but you're also the same customer who might get family subsidies, or TANF or SAVE or one of the other kinds of programs. But the information used to qualify you for one is not always necessarily the information you use to qualify you for the other. And so when you look at all of those interactions that low-income people have in the community, why aren't we able to cross those databases so that we make it easier for them to qualify for multiple programs. Now, I think we're seeing some communities that are beginning to do that, but it is around legislative issues that makes this a more palatable solution, as opposed to now burdening the individual to have to make 3 or 4 stops to sign up for unique energy assistance programs.
I think that you just made my head explode in a couple different ways. And how logical that is, which is kind of tough for me, Larry. You know that, as you always have to like bring me back into the conversation. But think about this. If the bill that is being brought before either the state or the federal House before it goes to the Senate, then you're sitting there thinking each one of those has different rules, regulations, steps, processes. And then after it becomes law, different agencies implement those programs with different expectations,
Absolutely.
different measurables. Holy smokes.
Yes. And so, but I don't want to leave the impression that this reflects something that our legislators aren't doing. I think it's reflective of a system that's 125, 140 years old that has operated in a way that has worked for that long. Right. And so, but now that we see that we have to change not only what we do, but in the way that we do that. And so it requires us to do something different. It requires us to look at this through a different kind of lens. We've lived in a world where it's been really, really comfortable for companies to go into a community and say, we understand what your problems are, and we've now brought you the solution. It's almost like going into your bag and you saying, here's the solution. And the community says, but that solution doesn't work for us because it leaves out part of us. They say, oh, don't worry about it. Take me that back and I'll give you another solution. And they'll pull it out of their bag and it's another solution.
Wow.
I honor a different approach.
Okay.
I honor the approach that says, let's go into that community without that bag of solutions and start at the bottom to understand what the issues are, where they exist in this community, and what the barriers are to changing not only the system, but the behavior of the people who are part of the system. So you go from a different vantage point and you start with, how do we know what the issue is and who has the issue? And now we start to build solutions based on the real challenge and the real problems, as opposed to the ones that we brought in with the handbag before.
I really like that, the way that you're lifting that up, Larry. Wow. And now, how do we implement that or articulate that to the folks, the legislature, and get action on that? Is there anybody that can help do that?
Well, yes. There's not only people who can help do it, but as we start to understand our roles as advocates,
right,
or I can either be an advocate or I can be I just lost the word, but let me make the point this way. When we understand how our legislative and governance system works,
right,
we are now able to insert ourselves at the important points so that we do get the kind of results. Every state or community has a public utility commission. They can call by different names,
right,
but they are a commission that manages the activity of those utility companies.
Right.
Whenever those important decisions are being made, they do hold forums. They do have opportunities for public comment. They do want to hear from people who are affected. The issue is we tend not to show up. So when we start talking about solutions, part of the solution is helping us to understand how to be advocates for
Who doesn't show up? Everybody?
the public very often doesn't show up.
Right.
And so they don't always get the feedback that's necessary. Now, but also what we know is that there are unique groups whose business it is to level or to level those opinions,
Right.
who now insert themselves as though they have the solutions for those communities. They don't always have that either. That's probably not a really good thing to say, but I will tell you that
You're talking about
oftentimes our advocates
right.
advocate for their interest.
I was about to say that they're self-centered advocates.
Yes, they are. And they're self-purposeful, and that's
Right.
how they stay alive. It's not that they don't perform a vital or a critical role in our communities, but let's
Right.
recognize, just call it what it is.
Right.
Yes.
Since you said I'm right on that. I'm like a crow on a June bug, because that line that you said, we've been doing these for 140 years. You and I were there when they were started. Why didn't we fix it back then?
Well, so this moves us into the second phase of the conversation that talks about the utilities and what their roles are in this energy transition. But I think we got to start back and understanding a couple of things around utility companies.
Right.
Utilities, while they do have this local monopolistic positioning,
right,
it was established because the utility companies and electricity was built for the good of the public.
Right.
It was built for the public good. And in order to do that, and in order to ensure that the greatest number of the public got access to services,
right,
there were some investments that were required.
Right.
And so the utility companies were asked and regulated to make these major investments. And these investments have long-term payoffs. Right? So now we get people, we get folks, adversaries who are saying, utility companies, what are they talking about? They don't need to make profit. They don't need to, they're just getting their shareholders. But I think what we often miss is the business side of the utilities and recognizing that business side versus the public policy balance. And so that then creates the utilities and function in a way that can be uniform from state to state to state to state. Because remember, it is required there's some uniformity because they share power. They share these lines across states, across territory. So we built a system to service people. Now we just can't throw it away like it's old clothes going to Goodwill and buy some more. And we call that, renewable energy. We call that all kinds of natural energy, and it doesn't cost us anything. It's really not true.
You're bringing up some fantastic points, Larry. And we've got the three grids. We have our ERCOT, East and West, but then we have the local or the broken down into regional centers into each one. And boy, those regional centers would be the one, because I have to go look and see how many of those regional centers there are. But those seem to be some of the key folks right there.
They are. And as we and Stu, as we start talking about this energy transition, so that we impact carbon, we impact greenhouse emissions, we institute carbon capture, we do these kinds of things to impact climate change. it also suggests that we're going to need to modify the systems that
Right.
we have. So as
Right.
you talk about regional, how about local systems? How about smaller, more
Nice.
nimble systems
Yep.
that feed into a bigger grid? I think that's what we're talking about as we move to the future. And so what's the role
Wow.
for that?
Okay. I'm gonna have to have you back because my head's spinning, Larry, and besides, it's an excuse for me to get to talk to you again. But I keep thinking my head, you know me, I'm just like, okay, wait.
I'm love, Stu, I love having these conversations with you. They're always so stimulating. You have such a vast caption on these issues. So yeah, I'm loving this. Thank you.
Let's spin off to a real concern of mine. And we just kind of hinted that at a little bit, and that is having the projects match the people, or that you just brought up the fantastic point, the local area.
Yes.
The one project is, one program is not going to fit everywhere. And the one that concerns me is, and again, I think it's a beautiful thing. It's a great idea. Let's get in the heat pumps into everywhere. I love the idea.
Yes.
But heat pumps, this goes back to your energy burden, 100%. And that is the renewable energy. You put that onto the grid, and that's a whole nother subject that we don't need to get into. But the higher price, as soon as you put renewables on the grid, the whole price of electricity goes up.
Absolutely, it does.
And so you get rid of coal, you get rid of natural gas, and then the price goes up, and you're getting a heat pump, and you're losing natural gas. The energy burden, because the program is there, is now increasing the burden of the people.
Yes. So, yes.
Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. It's often couched in the terms of it's the cost of progress.
Right.
Because we know that as we build these new sources,
right,
as we cancel existing sources,
right,
the cost is going to go up.
Right.
The cost, and while they may believe that because it's solar, there's no cost, there is great cost because there's no infrastructure.
Right.
So for an individual, the cost of energy now, in fact, does go up.
Right.
And here's the other side.
Right.
And when we couple that in unique kinds of communities, Washington, D.C. is one of those, where the cost of living is a plus 24%.
Right.
Versus the rest of the world. Now, not only is your housing cost more, but your energy is cost more, but it's more efficient, but it's costing you more. So what does that mean for me as a low income and LMI customer? It means I still can't afford
it. This is, me and my wanting to help folks and everything else. This just breaks my heart on this kind of stuff. As a solution, Larry, you and I talked about getting exclusions for areas where they have a coal plant and put carbon capture on it if they can, save the money, or leave a natural gas plant, which is cheaper for the cities that can support these programs to help keep the costs down and get those waivers. Because waivers and would make sense to get that down there, because that would encompass what you were talking about, is getting a total solution for these things, and then plan on getting rid of those as the technology improves. I mean, that to me would make sense.
Well, I heard something, I was reading something earlier today that talked about the future of energy. is the use of natural gas
Right.
infused with hydrogen.
Right.
And so what it all signals is that you're never really going to get away from natural gas.
Right.
You're never going to get away from some level of fossil fuels, nor should you, because I think there are great uses for them, primary and secondary uses, which we all have to be really mindful of.
Right.
And so as we look at what those solutions really begin to look like,
Right.
I think it's a hybrid. It's going to be a hybrid of some sort, and to which we probably don't even know today. And
I would agree with you.
It will show up. But the critical area for me is, how do we do that without increasing the energy burden on the people who are most affected? We talk about this whole thing, this energy burden, and we always say it's how much does your utility cost and how much of your money are you spending against utilities, and we say that's your energy burden.
Right.
I'd like to add a third piece to that stool.
Okay.
It's not only how much does this cost,
Right.
but it also includes your ability to make a living wage for affordability. And
Okay.
when we don't look at all of the measures, all of the impacts around energy burden, I think we fall short and don't really measure the total sense. Because in my mind, part of that is, what is your ability to recover from disaster?
Right.
That's part of that challenge as well when we talk about energy burden and equity and the like. So yeah, I don't want to get too far ahead of our conversation, but that's another part of it.
Oh, we have so many conversations. If you and I and Paula and my wife, we all went to dinner, it'd be like a 6-day dinner with all of our discussions. But when you brought up another point, and that is, when you take a look at the wages and you bring a look at that brings in the whole picture that I didn't even think about on that end of it, because I'm on the more technical side trying to say, hey, what about the lower cost? And you're also addressing some of the other social issues.
Yes, that gets to the affordability, and while we're very comfortable at talking about ways to make energy more efficient and ways to find new sources, I think we have to be equally as diligent to talk about the cost of disruption and who bears that cost. I'll give you another example. Last week, the president announced a program to increase the impact of solar, and particularly on individual homes. And how do we get more solar as a source of supply? And it's where we are. But the truth of the matter is that when you introduce solar, you're introducing a new energy source that has to fit into an existing grid. We talked about it, 125 years old, and it was built for a very specific purpose. And so it's not only, and once we figure out how to incorporate that energy, we now have to figure out what's the cost of incorporation. What's the disruption cost here? And once we do that, the legislation now gets to decide, what does it do for me as a customer? I live in, you call it, Maryland, and I now get solar on my house, and I now produce more solar than I'm using, and I now
Right.
am able to sell it back to the grid. How much do they pay me for it? Do they pay me retail? Do they pay me wholesale?
Right.
There's some legislation in some states where some utilities are asking, well, hold up, wait a minute. It costs us more if you have solar on your roof. So we should be able to charge you a premium or charge you a fee to be connected. And then when we get the solar power from you, it is our discretion as to how much we want to pay you for. Those are the kinds of arguments that they're set.
I just read an article, Larry, on that very thing in California. They're having legislation issues because they've got such a big push on the solar. And there's a whole nother discussion on solar, that all these things are starting to fill up in landfills because they've lived past their useful life. But you nailed it. You absolutely nailed it with the discussion on, oh, wait a minute, we need some of that money too.
Yes.
But you sit back and kind of go, and it makes sense, because then you have the business issue, you have the homeowner. But let's also ask about the cars. Everybody's talking about EV, and you talk about California, and they're doing legislation through regulation. That wasn't even a vote put to the people, right? And that one, it drives me nuts. But you sit back and you hear Secretary Granholm, and you even hear the president saying, anybody, we've got this new bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and then you say you're going to get an $8,000 tax burden, tax relief credit. Then you got to make the money. So here's a $60,000, $70,000 car. You can't afford that as it is. And then you're going to get a tax credit. And then the automakers, Ford, everybody just announced that their cars are magically going up $8,000. And this is just driving my head nuts. If we're going to do this, and then California this weekend said, don't charge your cars. So how do we address this issue?
Yeah, wow. Stu, there's a lot there to unpack, and I think it's significant. But I think you hit on something really pretty significant. So we can't talk about EVs without talking about electrification.
Right.
And as we look at that, and as we look at it through the lens, and we always bring us back, as we look at it through the lens of those LMI communities,
right,
it looks really, really different. Here's an example of my point. The average combustion engine vehicle,
right,
is owned for 7 to 10 years.
Right. Unless you're me. I drive them for a lot longer.
Yeah, well, you and I both. I'm a big believer that if you keep it well, it will last. But what we're talking about is moving into the next decade, where people who are still purchasing and still have the use of combustion engine cars, they're not going to flip them,
right,
like throw them out to Goodwill and go out and buy another $40, $50, $60, $75,000 vehicle
right,
that's electric. Here's the other point. They say, I'll give you a rebate,
right,
if you buy an electric vehicle, but let me offer, and there's some discussions around tax codes, and that the rebate is accessible only if you itemize your tax return.
Exactly.
And so we, in just the last couple of years, the individual itemized number has gone up. So most people now won't have to itemize. And so that discount, that rebate that you get, you don't ever see it because it's covered in your itemized deduction. And so while it sounds like it's there,
it's not there.
It's one of the challenges that we have.
Right.
And to do it. let me offer even just another. If I am a person who lives in a multi-unit complex,
Right.
and how now do I either share in this sense of community power,
Right.
or how do I now ensure that this new vehicle that I'm purchasing, I have access to charging, I have
Right.
access to power charging, because we know that there are multiple levels of chargers. And so which charger do you put in the community versus one? And can I now get a charger for my individual unit? I got a townhouse. Can I now run electricity so I can now charge my townhouse? All of those things come
Right.
into effect. And if you are a legislator sitting on the bench in that community, how do you rule? What are the new codes that you now have to
Wow.
build so that your buildings are in fact able to sustain this new power structure? What are the new legislative issues and costs and taxes that occur? Those, my whole point is that the issues are really complex, and they're not as simple as we often make them out to be. They're really complicated issues. And if you're a legislator or a regulator, man, you got to think about what your ruling does to those communities who've been disinvested for forever.
You know, Larry, every conversation you and I have is wonderful, but this one I think is one of our best ones so far, because you're bringing out a total picture, and that total picture needs resources.
Yes.
And you are a treasure, a national treasure, because you're a really cool resource for this. And there's not many people that have see, I've only got limited aspects and views, because I look at more of the technical, or, prices or power or that kind of stuff. But you've got both the social as well as all of these others. And so is that what the Glover Group is doing?
That's exactly what the Glover Group does.
Okay.
And if I had to coin a phrase, or I think we help to build that bridge between these affected communities and companies and regulators who need to do business with these communities. So we help to build that bridge so that the exchange, it is a two-way exchange, that information is not only exchanged, but the solutions that we have are not just solutions for the companies and how to address their issue, but that the solutions that we have helps to make this community a better community. If you will allow me just one example.
Okay.
We talk about infrastructure.
Right.
But what we don't talk about is community infrastructure.
Now, what's the difference?
And this community infrastructure has a real base.
Right.
For example, part of the community infrastructure are those agencies or not-for-profits who provide support and assistance to those low and moderate income individuals.
Right.
Part of the community infrastructure is how do our schools align with our ability to have access to communication and to broadband in our communities.
Right.
How do we build programs, that companies build programs that make it easier for the agencies to manage those programs in the community? Oftentimes what we know is that the people who work in our agencies and our social service agency, and particularly those that are community-based, they're not too friggin' far away from being the client versus being the server.
You're right.
But if we're able to strengthen their organization from a capacity standpoint and help them to build capacity,
Right.
we now make it easier for them to transition that data and that information to the companies who are trying to integrate with the folks in this
Wow.
community. That's what I mean about community infrastructure. How are we creating
Wow.
our communications so that at the end of the day, we don't just take new technology, drop it into a disadvantaged community and say, see, we've now given you the best technology.
Right. But it doesn't work.
How do we make the members of that community understand it,
Right.
who are educated about its impact, and
Right.
who understands that the need is more than just some stuff. The need is really behavior change. And how do we
Well
now
said.
begin to instill behavior change so
Right.
that these communities are in lockstep as we make this energy transition?
I love
That's
that,
how I
Larry.
think.
Behavior change. That is critical.
Yes, yes. Remember, you're maybe old enough, but you're not an East Coast guy. There used to be a store on the East Coast, a clothing store, and it was called Sims, and
Okay.
it was owned by a gentleman, but his tagline was, "An educated customer is my best consumer."
Ah,
And he's absolutely right. And so I think the same thing exists when we're talking about how to transition communities, because if we educate those communities to be better and to function better,
right.
when they get on the other side, they are a better community, and they're a sustainable community, which is
Wow.
really the key.
Larry, I'm just sitting here and I'd love to hug you again. I mean, this is so cool. There's a couple things. I'm already thinking, and you know that I zip off on different ones, and I want to make sure we get a panel to talk about this, and we'll do the panel in the future and get the right people on it, because this word needs to get out there and everything else. The other thing is, again, thank you so much, but give me the last word. You got the last word, and give me your last thoughts. Larry, what's on your mind?
Stu, I'd say that as we plan, legislate, and regulate our way into this new energy transition,
Right.
whether the mark on the wall is 2030, 2045, 2050,
Right.
let's recognize that the way that we engage with communities
Right.
will be one of the determinants of the success of this energy transition.
Right.
Because unless we transition these communities as we do this and bring them along with us,
Right.
we will now be facing and having the same conversation in 2035, in 2050, because
Right.
it won't happen, because we've spent a lot of money changing things and not a lot of money investing in impacting people.
I just love the way you've got this whole thing wrapped around in this whole thing. So Larry, this has been a very, very refreshing conversation, and we're going to have this rascal out as soon as we can. But I'm already looking forward to our next one, because I've already got my crayon out and I've got my notes for the next one, and we're going to have a blast. So thank you.
I so look forward to it.
And
Thank you, and thanks to the team. This has been great. You know, I always love just talking to you, and for you to give me a platform to share out my perspective on some of these issues. I can't thank you enough.
I got one last thing, and that is, I think you got to run for president. And at a minimum, we need to introduce you. I don't care what party it is. you need to be some panel member in the next administration, because I absolutely love the way you think. This is not about political party. This is about people.
This is
And
about people.
And I love that. Thank you, Larry. And we will see everybody next time.